Hey boys, hello.
Yo.
Hey.
Hey.
Yo, I'm fucking excited to talk to you guys.
Yeah, this will be fun.
It's such a joy.
I've been looking around for someone like you.
Yeah. You.
You.
Yeah, it makes you think of Soldier Boy, but you. Yeah. Whoa, man, what the?
They're really going through something.
There was that era in music where like everyone sort of became toddler-esque, like baby, you know, like sing like a fucking baby.
Well, I think actually that's what's right now. But I think what characterized the previous vocal affectation of like, you know, the early 2010s was just like intense emotion. Like everyone, like fucking, you know, Mumford & Sons, Florence and the Machine. Everyone was going through something.
Mumford & Sons. Like, I know it's a podcast and we often talk about inside jokes, but there really is an inside joke with the Mumford & Sons, and I, without actually just doing the whole joke and an impression, you know?
I think the jig is necessary.
The jig, you need to see it.
It's a visual joke.
You need to see it to believe it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're Žižek and so on. I'm Jacob.
Hey Jake, it's Will. How you doing?
My name is Peter, and I'm also present.
Yeah. Present. Yeah. Hey guys.
Žižek and so on. Patreon episode part 2. Hegel and a Wired Brain. We primed it. We put the pump in the hole of the car, whatever you call it.
Fuel tank.
We're gassed up. We're ready to go. Ready to get to the kind of like real theoretical core of the book, I think.
Amen. Well, that sums it up for today's episode.
As they say in the new Gnosticism of the singularity. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
As they say in the new Gnosticism of the singularity.
Well, that's a good point, but to that I say.
This is the problem. You won't be able to tell any jokes with singularity, right?
No, it's a humorless. It's a humorless fucking.
The whole thing is humorless because humor is premised on the unexpected, and like.
Yeah, like the coffee without cream, right? Like the thing about that joke is that it's first of all it's a joke.
It's a joke.
Not to mention the point that he uses it to make, or the many points that he uses it to make. But the fact that it's a joke is significant in this sense, isn't it?
Well, do you think that something like implication is foremost an interpretive thing and requires the failure of language? Like, or rather, the difference between meaning and signification? Like.
Yeah, I think it's a really good way of putting it.
And that's a little bit of a shout out to Todd and Ryan, because I listened to their symbolic part of their symbolic order episode, and Todd dragged out this like neat little like difference between meaning and signification that I was like, oh yeah, duh, right.
Can I guess at it just based on Todd and his whole vibe?
Yeah.
Like in this case, could we say like meaning in some sense is spirit, and then like signification is the particular instances, the shape of the real, the shape of the universal, that meaning manifests as. Is that a fair guess?
Well, that's kind of funny because he doesn't like, it's a purely Lacanian episode. Like, I mean, I'm only 30 minutes in, but they're not explicitly referencing Hegel. And so it's kind of fun that you're actually providing a sort of Todd McGowan take on his own interpretation of Lacan. But no, there's something, the symbolic order, to speak, just purely in Lacanese, like the symbolic order provides the sort of the gap between meaning and signification, is that signification is not guaranteed. You can never be taken for how you mean. So you mean things, you have intention to mean something, but what it signifies is completely arbitrary and also a matter of the tension between and the gap between
right
language and
the
what
gap.
But meaning can never, like, you can never it's ultimately a failure in signification, but meaning can never be conveyed in anything other than signification, right?
Right.
It's always going to be signified, but signified incompletely.
Well, this is what's really this is important for Žižek and Hegel and the Wired Brain, is he talks about the important and constitutive gap between, your thoughts and reality. And he says that in that gap is actually the placeholder of freedom, what it is to be free. Is that in your mind, you can think all that you want to think and mean all that you want to mean. And then and that's separate from reality. And I think he's trying to suggest that in singularity, when reality and your mind are one and the same, then we are eliding or effacing that placeholder, that gap between your thoughts and reality. And so I don't know, we're back to Will, like implication and humor, or humor that requires implication, I think requires the failure of language, that gap between your thoughts and what means, or rather what signifies, more importantly.
Yeah, at least a disruption in the continuity between the seeming smooth functioning of the signifier and the signified, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
because in what Elon Musk is saying, taking away language as a requirement for communication, it's a direct. He's trying to enact a kind of direct system of signification without the problem of signifiers.
Right. Yeah, or as we were saying before,
meaning rather.
On our last episode, as we were saying, the sort of, I think I said fetish, but I think I meant more fantasy of a meta language.
Yeah, well, I think there's something fetishistic about putting aside what for all these tech geeks appears as a kind of limit to their lives, that it's kind of like the ultimate geek's revenge. It's like the best movie franchise. You remember that those nerd movies from the 80s where
Baby Geniuses.
No, the ones where it's Revenge of the Nerds or something like that, where the nerds become jocks. But it's I feel like this is that kind of ressentiment reversal, where your corrupted body, your failure to have everything you want in your life is reversed, and you become a mind, a wired brain, Chad.
Like the blue guy in Watchmen.
Yeah.
Well, you said
Doctor Amazing. Doctor Fantastic. What's his name?
Doctor Terrific. No, but with fetish and fantasy, I think there's actually an analysis to be done on both terms, because fantasy is actually the imaginary realm within the symbolic that requires the symbolic order in order to be propped up. The imaginary realm is how we see the symbolic. The symbolic's actually just sort of like this. It's an order. It's essentially the resource through which we construct our fantasies. And ultimately, singularity on some level has to be a kind of fantastical construction within a symbolic order, but one that presupposes or supposes, I think, a new symbolic order. One that is, it's weird. It's purely imaginary and fantastical, and yet are we post-ego with singularity? So are you sort of getting rid of the imaginary realm altogether, and it's just pure symbolic realm, or is it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Would it be symbolic at all?
Pure symbolic realm.
See, if Musk's promises are made, real, it's hard to imagine a situation in which there wouldn't be language, right? But if there weren't language, then it seems like you're dealing with a non-symbolic order, and maybe that's a purely imaginary order.
I think about singularity as this and sorry, Pete. Maybe we'll end this Lacanian detour and then head back to the beginning of the analysis. But what's interesting is that the pre-mirror stage, I think, suggested by singularity is the baby who, it doesn't actually have to be the literal mirror, as we know with the Lacanian mirror stage, but sees itself and sees in itself a continuity, right, a wholeness in the mirror, which is its ego, right, its image, its imago, and if we go back to a pre-mirror stage with singularity, or if it promises a kind of pre-mirror stage existence in which you don't have to translate your desires through the symbolic realm, I'm just trying to figure out in Lacanese what this actually fucking means. Like,
well, I think what we're
do you
trying
not have to have an ego in singularity because your desires don't have to be rendered
Well,
within
what would you be identifying with?
Well, I think at this point where it's the loss of the individual, right?
Yeah.
I think if I were, I think maybe we could be. So this, we're kind of skirting around one of his chapters, which is entitled "Wired Brain and Its Limitations."
Let's get to it.
And there are 6 or 7 main limitations that Žižek describes in the chapter, and I think it would be kind of interesting to go through them, because we're definitely referencing a few of them, but we're kind of maybe stacking them on top of each other. So it's
sure.
maybe for a bit of nuance, it'd be cool to like just see what Žižek says and then just kind of toss that around a little
It
bit.
would be an absolute first on Žižek and so on to be like didactic and order for sure. Let's do it.
Okay, so in that chapter, Žižek says the first and rather obvious philosophical approach to this vision of wired brain and the subject who lives the wired brain. The first and rather obvious philosophical approach to this vision arises from the so-called externalist theory of consciousness. My self-awareness is not in my brain. It is rooted in my individual bodily existence. It is meaningful only within this horizon, as a moment of my concrete embodied existence, which comprises the thick web of interactions with others. So what survives of my mental state when it is torn from this concrete context? In this part, he's talking about he gives an example of a particular area of consciousness that says it's like there's the external world, like he says there's an example, a traditional example of like a waterfall. Like the waterfall still exists whether or not a subject is looking at it. And then he kind of turns to the tired and true and trustworthy example of a table. Like there's still a table that exists beyond one person's view of it. But that so like the wired brain, this externalist view of the wired brain depends on like say there's a video feed of someone's consciousness, like of the way they see themselves in the world. You could just hook up another person and they would see the same thing, right? Because this view of consciousness depends on it being fundamentally linked to the world out there.
Right.
Well, there's this wired brain or like Neuralink response to that. At least I think he's actually quoting Elon Musk, which is like to go beyond the visual, but like you can essentially beam your loved one in to see the waterfall that you're seeing, and they don't happen to be there, but you beam them in, you stream them in, and then you can put the taste and the smell. You can kind of layer all of the senses, and that's supposed to kind of be a response.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, what one could say the problem with that is that even when we're seeing a beautiful waterfall or a beautiful, majestic, flowing table, you're seeing it's still always mediated by, oh, maybe I've been to this table before and I've seen its intricate flowing legs, and there's a memory of like, say you were there with your ex-girlfriend or something. Say you it's from your childhood, right? Like you're not always, your experience isn't always the immediate surroundings in which you're placed in, right? There's always going to be some reference that you're making to your emotional state, or
that's a deeply psychoanalytic point. I mean, I think it's like, it's almost like, to me, it's actually, once again, like a kind of refute to object-oriented ontology. But there's like, if we consider the material world to be just this sort of like brute perceptive data that is like on an equal plane in which everything is sensed and democratically, right, in the same way. It's like, it doesn't account for how subjectivity imbues the world. And this isn't necessarily just like I don't think that it's just like a humanist argument to say that the world is constantly imbued with more than just sense, right? It's not just simply perception. And I don't think so. To Elon's point, it's still not your senses. If I can taste what you're tasting and smell what you're smelling and see what you're seeing, they're still not my own. So there's an element of maybe perhaps like you can push it to like a shared a different form of sharing, but it's not.
Yeah, that's where Žižek goes next. But he does take this description of how a subject, like how the debate of like what exactly is the role of self-awareness with taking into consideration the singularity. But it's interesting in his kind of Žižekian move, he always ties it back to his greater project, and to Hegel as well. And his kind of counter to, the kind of like externalist notion of subjectivity is that, yes, there's obviously material reality out there, but like each person's subjectivity is like they cross over one another while not being the same thing, and they're not co-equal with that external reality while it's still applying to it.
It just makes me wonder, what would be the relation of, the singularity mind, or one in the singularity, to the external world? Would it just be like a collective inscription of a communal understanding onto the material world? Would there be, Žižek's whole thing about, our perception of the world in terms of the parallax is like the inscription of our desire into the object, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that seems to operate on, a kind of dispersed level in the sense that everyone, has their own particular relation with the world. But how could that possibly be collectivized and then singularized in the singularity? Could there be, what would be a collective simultaneous desiring of reality, in the sense of perceiving it in the way that Žižek means when he's describing how we perceive reality, kind of on our own isolated subjects? Well,
didn't we discuss how the singularity is the loss of desire, right?
Right. So that's what that's what
which I think brings us.
It was a leading question.
Wait, this is a trap.
Well played. Yeah. Well, I think it does away with if that's the relationship to desire that it has, and if it sort of elides the possibility of a parallax view, then it definitely does something with the objet patia. Like, does it get rid of it altogether?
Yeah. Then, if that's Žižek's kind of working definition for how we literally perceive reality, what becomes of how we perceive reality in the singularity? What are you seeing?
Well, yeah, I think that brings us quite conveniently to,
because just to force that point a little bit, because it's an ontological claim he's making about the way that we actually see reality, and we're wrapped into it in these depictions, the unorientables, the Klein bottle and the Mobius strip, etc. What becomes of the material world in that sense, from that ontological perspective?
Well, in a sense, the ontological component is interesting, because for Žižek, we are the ontological incompleteness of reality. The negativity is subjectivity.
Right. Right.
So it's definitely an interesting question when you take away a system, or when you implant a system that actually doesn't recognize negativity and is entirely positively constituted, in terms of like negativity is not like, you can't code negativity, right? Maybe in some sense you could argue that if they somehow got a handle on Kantian and Hegelian philosophy and were somehow coded it, but at this point the sciences are completely concerned with what is reality, what is given, what is positively measurable. You can't measure negativity. So because you can't, I think they're coding the whoever's creating this product and testing it and hypothesizing it. It's all about the positive reality and the positive ability to create technologies that emulate what they're measuring, say in the brain.
Right. I see what you mean.
But I think that brings us. Sorry, Jake. Did you have a thought there?
I think maybe maybe we're actually pushing the concept of singularity too far into this extreme in which we all see the same thing, we all experience the same thing.
I think the singularity is a kind of moment of the merging of the mind and technology, where like because they merge, and because of the interconnectedness of the technology, you like exceed out of yourself,
Sure.
become the singular. It's
Sure.
it's
Yeah,
the one.
Yeah.
But I think that brings it to the second limit that Žižek understands in this kind of notion of the singularity, or the wired brain rather. And I think we've kind of gestured towards it a bit, but he says it's a little sorry, I was about to read what I said. He says the viewer doesn't see the world; he is part of a world process in some radical sense. I, as a viewing subject, am never directly part of the world in which my perception takes place, since every reality that I perceive already relies on my specific subjective standpoint. By definition, I cannot directly locate myself in reality, since this would mean that I somehow stepped out of myself and looked at myself objectively from nowhere.
Correlationism.
All right. Yeah. That's where I think we were trying to get in the conversation we were just having.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How can you possibly remove the subject from experience?
Like observation of the world is always from a particular standpoint, and there's no neutral way of observing the world.
Yeah, they call this the event horizon, right? This is, I think, also a borrow from Todd and Ryan. There's this fucking movie from the 90s, I think. It's called Event Horizon, but it sort of brilliantly describes what I think to be a thoroughly Lacanian point, which is that the event horizon is the point at which you can observe an event without effect. So, like, for example, just I think a metaphoric or analogy to this would be the way we experience third world news is like we can observe it, we digest it, and yet we're not affected by it, by the fucking murders in Sarajevo, the wars in the Congo, whatever. Even arguably stuff that happens like next door, right? Like with like the wildfires in California, is we're able to like observe them, and yet like I go on with my everyday.
Yeah, I think what's embedded in this particular point that he's making here is what we pointed to earlier in terms of like you can't share a particular placedness of reality in terms of like your own subjective experience of it, in terms of like your memories and your traumas and your like emotional states. But maybe like let's say you can, like somehow they're able to capture that. There's still the problem, and this is limit 3 that Žižek thinks, of language. He says, even if we endorse the feasibility of shared experiences, various questions arise here. The first concerns the role of language in the formulation of our thoughts and our inner life in general.
Yeah, he's got a problem with the concept of inner life, as ever with Žižek, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that it's not to be trusted, but I also feel like at the end of the book, he actually brings it back as something that's important. Like I don't think singularity does away with the rich inner life. That is like fundamentally not to be trusted, says Žižek, but also it is part of human subjectivity and part of its failure, right? Is that we have this relationship to reality that is structured along a linguistic line, right? Mm-hmm. That is purely ordered
and ideological.
Exactly. A self-relating, right? A reflexivity that is proper to the unconscious, that is purely human, and is part of the failure embedded in humanity. But like it's interesting that Žižek will sometimes say this inner life is something that's not to be trusted. It's actually a deep illusion, but as such,
right. But I think like in terms of the ability to capture, clearly there's some sort of interiority to our experience, right? Like, but for him, it's like that interiority is mediated through language, and it, in fact, like is language. But like, if language and its kind of inability to say what we fully mean, language is also crucially what is unsaid, what is like ironically meant, what is joked, what is what is implied. There's all these components of language that aren't like overt kind of compact, comfortable like meanings
Well,
of
signification
even a
is
single word.
signification is only a result of the failure of language, and singularity seems to propose the idea that we could do away with that failure. Like, you'll know exactly what I mean.
Yeah.
Which is to say, which is to suggest that in my head, in my inner life,
You know exactly what you mean.
I know exactly what I mean. But,
Yeah.
but Žižek's saying that our thoughts, if we take them to be structured by by language, and if our thoughts are linguistic, then that problem cannot be reduced. That problem cannot be fully resolved, because even our inner life, so to speak, before it's linguistic, or is always already structured like a language.
Yeah. What's that?
Of language.
Jake, you have memorized. What's the T.S. Eliot? That's not what I meant. That's not what I meant at all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Yeah. That's
a nice reading of it. I like that.
Totally. Yeah. In fact, when I first read that poem, I was like, this, that was my Derrida age, but I was like, oh, this is fucking, talk about a structuralist poem, right? Mm-hmm. That is not it at all. That is not what I meant at all. It's great. If one, anyway, I won't go through the poem, but that's totally it, right? It's this you always missed me, that is embedded in language. But yeah, so I think the problem.
One more poetry reference from Metaphors of a Magnifico by Wallace Stevens, as he's walking over the bridge. Of what was I thinking? So the meaning escapes.
Right. Right. It's exactly. Those two are almost the same refrain. Actually, it's so brilliant. Yeah. Really, they communicate the same thing.
And that's part of the wealth of experience, right? Is the ways in which we miss, like the ways in which we drop a line of thinking, or something which doesn't accord with our physical surroundings, or accord with our even perspicuous mental associations with a scene. It's like the inconsistencies there.
And poetry, I think it's like a good example. Poetry is a fantastic example in this case, because like what could poetry be in the singularity, right? Like poetry is all about the stand-in and the like when you say like a synecdoche, for example, like when you say like when you're referring to a boat and you say a sail, right? Mm-hmm. Like that, the stand-in, the association, the rhyme, the allusion, all these are not like you can't like, I mean, well, it's like
inferment is ontological. It's actually kind of amazing how well language functions for how fucking broken it is, fundamentally and constitutionally lacking it is and the gap between meaning and signification. It's kind of amazing how well it does work. And actually, one of the other lines in J. Alfred Prufrock is, it's impossible to say just what I mean, but as if a magic lantern through the nerves and patterns on a screen, and so when I've never actually thought about it in this terms, but so if a magic lantern through the nerves and patterns on the screen, nerves, like he's actually kind of making it neurological, right? This sort of like, as if a magic lantern were throwing those nerves on a screen, projecting them. It's like our brain gets projected through language on a screen, and it's this silhouette of what we might be thinking, and yet through language we actually project it, and fucking hell, it has a shape. It makes a shape. It's kind of
I love that. No, that was really nice.
That's a really nice reading.
Well, you threw out that poem. I'm like, oh right, there's another line that speaks to that. But anyway, next fucking.
Well, ironically, can I just say one more thing? Like,
yes, you can.
It sounds weird to say this about poetry, but I think something we're getting at about poetry is its kind of virtual status, that it's not materially existing, and it seems to touch on something which occupies the distinction perhaps between a cup of coffee without cream and a cup of coffee without milk, right? Because Žižek references this line a lot, but I'm not sure if I've heard him reference the kind of poetic aspect to it as well. There is a poetic valence to that difference, that virtual difference there, I think.
Totally. You know what it does is it suggests that there's actually a difference in absence, right? That absence can be differently construed and mean different things, which is essentially the backbone of language, right? Is that all the things that the word that you say doesn't mean lurk behind your meaning, behind the signification. Yeah. And so coffee without cream and coffee without milk are somehow different, you know, and
Yeah,
they're somehow
yeah.
different than plain coffee too, and they're different because the absence that's construed and inferred and is ultimately different. Fucking brilliant. And that's Peter, your idea about, like, you know, programming purely the positive elements of experience. It would pick up only on the fact that the coffee was, you know, elementally the same, right? There'd be the common denominator, and so we would sort of do away with that poetic inferment, which so all language is fucking poetry, is the lesson of today. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's we can get let's slide into a Heidegger and so on reading of this.
Hit this joint. All language is poetry. Yeah.
Language is the house of being.
Like old stately British Heidegger, who in this case isn't a Nazi.
Winston Churchill, read Heidegger.
But I mean, I think another way.
Language is the air. Language is the water.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Part of like what Elon Musk is criticizing in language is that it's always inaccurate, and that like we have to distill and reduce the vast like complexity of our mind and our brain processes, and like just form them into these really simple ideas, trade them to someone else who takes that really simple idea and then expands it again in their mind. So like what he thinks is a solution is to have that organic, complete, extended mind process be able to like be conveyed instead of language. But part of what that doesn't recognize is the requirement, that is premised on the notion that the more information you have, the better, right? Like the more access to the information you have will always be a good thing. But the counter to that is like we're inured, we're completely buried in information right now, and it's not making anyone's life better. That we actually need to reduce, and the crucial component and element of language is that it reduces. And his example is Hegel, who talks about when children are learning how to draw, they draw in all this color, and then adults they don't do that. They draw in like simple line drawings in black and white. But that black and white, that reduction, is actually a more thorough understanding of the world and reality.
Yeah. One of my favorite actual examples of Žižek's, for sure. Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know if you guys have much more to add there. Basically, the simple point there is that the one of the crucial components of language and of thinking is reduction. Simplifying the amount that you could say or are thinking.
Just to interject, when I watched Elon introduce the pigs in the chip, he kept on fucking saying, "Let me simplify, let me simplify, let me simplify," which was like A, kind of insulting, B, kind of suggesting that maybe he doesn't actually know the intricacies of what's going on, and C, he's doing this linguistic trope, which is like, well, I can't fucking explain this to you, so
let
me simplify, and he just kept doing, like, he says it fucking time and again, and you're like, okay, interesting, you're relying on, you know, a very, like, what I'll call an intense reduction, you know, this complex thing that I'm showing you, let me just put it this way, and it's like, okay, so you are actually relying on the accuracy of language as a process of simplification, and also calling me a fucking idiot, and probably lying to me. But anyway.
Yeah. Jake, are you saying that you hate all South Africans?
Yes.
And Beyonce fans?
Yeah. And and honestly, miners, emerald miners too. I've not met one before, but I don't think I'd like them.
The Fifth Limit, which is a good like 90s action movie title.
Fifth Element, yeah.
Fifth Limit.
Sexuality.
Yeah. It would be the fucking Fifth Limit, wouldn't it?
He says,
"Come over to my house. I'll show you the Fifth Limit."
Žižek says, what we find in human sexuality is the obverse of simplification, which gives birth to a surplus, an unnecessary complication which prevents the direct access to a goal. Human sexuality comes in a variety of perverted forms and procedures, which not only cannot be reduced to different ways to reach the same goal of procreation, but often run directly against this goal. However, one should always bear in mind that this excessive diversity is set in motion by an underlying impossibility or antagonism. And that sexuality is the whole process of courtly love, which he talks about quite extensively, actually, is about the dance of implication. You know, it's still linguistic, but like it's the limiting of your actions and of you know, your possible physical relations so as to more fully build upon them.
The fact that it's a fucking failure. I mean, and also, like, you know, I think he's also suggesting, like, to almost make it anti-poetic. It's like, we're not just taking away, it's not just taking away the possibility of courtship. It's like, no one actually wants just coitus. Like,
yeah, because that's just animal sex, right?
Exactly. And it's not, and that's, well, we fundamentally can't do that. It's not like, you know, there's even people, the proclamation, wow, I sound like such a lame-o, but like, you know, I just want to fuck. It's like, actually, you know, even that in itself is a deeply like sexual and therefore, or like is of sexuality, right? Like this sort of like, I just want to have, you know, I just want to have sex. I want to get laid. It's like that in and of itself is not just, I want to, you know, I want to fuck, like, you know, I just want to have coitus. I want to reproduce. There's something still very ideological and symbolic going on there and deeply linguistic. And so still an element of human sexuality, because we can't just have sex. In fact, what is ultimately enjoyable is the failure, right? Is that, the woman in the dream is not my mother. You know, it's like it's not just fucking sex. There's a lot that's negated and a lot that's present in the failure. Anyway.
There's so much that Žižek comments on with sexuality. We definitely have to. I mean, so far we've joked before. It's kind of like the repressed aspects to Žižek and so on, because we haven't explicitly dealt with the topic of sexuality yet. And I think it's because we want to talk to Alenka Zupancic about it, who wrote What is Sex? But I think there's also a very funny element to that too, because we're waiting to talk to a woman about it, which is
I know there's actually so much taboo that's going on regarding that, but ultimately, like, the funny thing is we're also kind of always talking about it, you know what I mean? Like,
Jake, well, all life is sex, man. Like, everything that people do is just sex, you know.
Cue the Woody Allen quote, you know, but anyway, no, it's an important topic that we kind of skirt.
I can't die in a plane crash. I'm an atheist.
Is that what he says?
I don't get what that has to do with this specifically, but
well, he said everything in life is about sex except for sex. Sex is about power.
Right. Yeah, there's something, like, just to go back, he says, like, it's a surplus that derives from an unnecessary complication. Like, it's not necessary. I mean, like, what's necessary really in sexuality is reproduction of the species, if you're going to be, like, you know, technical about it. But clearly that's not what people are talking about when talking about sex. Like, no one's like the pervasive role that sexuality plays in society is not because everyone's obsessed with babies. It's like it's the complication that people are obsessed with.
Yeah. Speak for yourself, though, eh?
Jake, I'm doing a live fact check on you on that quote. It's
again with the fact checking. Okay.
It's either Oscar Wilde or it's some people think it's Oscar Wilde, but this other website says that it's unattributable.
Well, no, because he says it in Annie Hall, I'm fairly certain. So
he does. I think he does.
Yeah. So
I think Gandhi said that, actually.
I thought it was Abe Lincoln. Yeah. Mark Twain. Anyway, Will, now I'm paying attention. I'm ready for the fact checking.
Oh yeah.
That was the fact. That was the fact check.
You know, Will's got like 4 monitors. You know, like
I thought it was nerve center for a second. And so on.
Well, actually,
at the HQ, yeah. Fuck.
But for a second, I thought it was Oscar Wilde, and I was laughing to myself because I thought, like, Jake could not have picked a person who's more opposite to Oscar Wilde than Woody Allen.
What? Art imitates life, man.
Okay, so So I think the kind of umbrella limit here with the wired brain is the fundamental. It's going to sound redundant, but
You got this.
It's the dialectical process or antagonism, right? Like I can't account for the dialectical process, and there's like all of what we've said so far is basically Žižek kind of connects all of that to the dialectical process, right? Like he uses sexuality as a way of describing the ontological antagonism, the dialectic, right? So in that, so he says, instead of bothering with the question, can Neuralink capture the true meaning or flow of our thoughts, we should focus on a different question. Can it capture the overlapping of too little and too much indicated by Hegel? Can it capture the excess produced by the failure itself?
I didn't want to bring this up until like our conclusion episode, which, stay tuned for everyone. But I'm thinking, okay, singularity changes the material, right? It actually changes, honestly, man's relationship to material.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, okay, what I wanted to say for the conclusion is the sort of parallelism, at least sort of a tenuous parallelism between communism and singularity. And I'm thinking, okay, if singularity offers a new relationship to the material world by essentially, what is the suggestion that it does away with the dialectic?
Well, it can't.
There's
it's
nothing dialectical.
Non-dialectical. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing. At least the way it's been described initially is there's like sort of nothing dialectical about singularity, right? About the relationship between the subject and the objective world, right? Is substance and subject
because it's a self-relating totality, right? Whereas whereas a dialectical totality would relate to things that are not itself, right?
Yeah.
If that's a weird way of putting it, but I think
it's certainly a way of putting it. Like it's not wrong.
So is substance still subject in singularity, or is substance and subject is like?
Yeah, no, I think I.
How do you formulate that?
Well, the way
substance is substance.
Well, Kurzweil tries to in the tradition of scientists trying to like pedantically use a philosophy to like explain away their own like. My reading of it is like, I'm participating in this world-ending AI. I'm just gonna like find some cool Heidegger quotes that can kind of explain away my guilt, but.
Nietzsche is usually used in that.
Yeah, he's a favorite. Yeah. But like he says, Kurzweil says like this is the Hegelian joining of subject and substance, right? Like this is the ultimate end of the Hegelian system, and like you could think like that. Like that is that's a reading of it. But in Žižek and certainly Todd's reading of it, it's like there's no end to the Hegelian system, right? It's ultimately going to subsume itself, right? Like there's still moments of spirit. There are spirits, but like the spirit is merely the process of itself, right? Like there's no like end point in the way that Žižek understands it. And I think that's like, it's not that substance is subject enfin, you know what I mean? Like, period. As if there is an event in which substance becomes subject. It's actually wow, Pete, what happened? I can't continue talking while I'm watching you. I took the triumphant sip of my beer, and I was like, what is that in my mouth? And it was a fucking fly.
That's substance becoming subject right there.
Failure to fully consume my beer. That's the dialectical process.
But it's not a substance becoming subject is not something that is teleological and posits an end. It's the very process of spirit that is continual. And I think, like, once again, I'm going to say, I wanted to save this for the conclusion, but he says in singularity, this is Žižek, it will not be the immersion in a selfless collective thought, but the experience of a radical gap or split. The subject will maintain a minimum distance towards the collective, and this distance will be the source of suffering and emancipation. And that, to me, is crucial. So there will not be a kind of final substance becoming subject. There will be a radical split, a radical gap still maintained in singularity, and it will be a minimal distance between, the collective and the subject. And I wonder if that is something. I wonder if that's Žižek presupposing that there'll be a choice.
I don't know. Yeah,
like how do you resist once within the singularities? Is like if we
that's another limit here, right? It's another inherent tension, because like to what degree are we all included in this, right? Like clearly there will be an intense class dimension to who gets to be a part of Elon Musk's fancy little new world, right? Like already with his, who's going to go to the moon, who's going to go in that stupid fucking tunnel, who's going to have enough money to implant one of these things in their brain, right? Like there's a pay to play in this situation, and like, maybe at a certain point it'll like everyone will get hooked up, but like clearly one of the main probably immediate implications of a new technology like this is an even greater stratification of who's included and excluded.
Well, but that to me is still like that's a materialist, like I want to say, reading of that, and I think that Žižek also in this book kind of puts forth an idealist answer, which is that what still survives is the empty subject and the virtual unconscious, right? Which he says. I mean, I'm basically quoting him. And I wonder, like, that has material implications, of course. But if I also think of, like, if I do think about it in purely materialistic, like historical materialism terms, like the rabble will become those who are still human and those who go post-human. Exactly. And I wonder, like, I don't know, like, I don't think there is. Yeah, the substance and subject thing, I'm still fucking hung up on that a little bit. Like,
well, I think that's just like simply like a kind of deep, like, I think I'm not at the stage of what like I'm reading in this chapter here. I'm not reading it through his conclusion, because honestly, I read it a little while ago and I kind of forget. But also in the interest of maybe leaving it for a later date, like at this point, one of the inherent tensions in it, and the inherent tension that kind of subsumes all the other ones is that it's non-dialectic, and that it doesn't abide by the kind of like inherent tension of the ontological configuration that Hegel and Žižek
which is purely dialectical.
Which you could say like hey man, that's your point of view, which is fine, but like we're talking about Žižek here, and we're like but like I think it's quite a good argument for what ultimately is a kind of limitation on this technology and on the singularity, is that it doesn't involve what is virtual, what is left unsaid, what is implied, what is poetic, what is not funny,
right?
All these things, because it doesn't account for that. What is this sparse yet somehow abundant reality in which we're all going to be communicating with, authentically? What is it besides all of those things, and why is that better?
It's not a coincidence, I think, that post-human is being squared off with a post-antagonistic sense of reality, or proposition of a reality without antagonism, which harkens back to basically any form of totalitarianism, right? Which is, we're going to fully close the gap on our society, right? It's like the Nazis will get rid of the Jew, which is, as we know, in terms of Žižek's like lingo, like that stands for the fundamental and constitutive gap, the almost even the fetishized, right? Substitution or support, rather. Excuse me, I meant support. And I think so. It's not a coincidence. I think that post-human is being mutually defined with a space that is completely without antagonism. And it's like, so capitalism and communism have always been responses to the fundamental antagonism. And now in a post-capitalist capitalism or a post-human humanism, they'll just this smooth, as we joked last episode, this smooth without antagonism existence, which man, it's fucking totalitarian. My God.
Oh my God, yeah. In so many deep ways. Because not only does it involve a limitation of our ability to act in the world and like how we interact with other people, it involves our very like subjective awareness.
Well, suggests the difference between singularity and communism. It's like essentially this is a structure, an ideological structure that will assume that it is complete, and will by way of technology function as if it's complete.
What do you mean like the singularity as opposed to communism, or you mean the singularity?
Well, there's a suggestion that they're like kind of quite similar, and on a first reading, there's like this.
Well, I don't think he's saying that it's similar. I think he's saying that one of the like okay, he clearly critiques communism very extensively, not only in this book, but it's part of his whole project as a whole. But in order to kind of more properly theorize it, and maybe come to it in terms of a kind of eventual happening, but like it's what he's critiquing in the Soviet Gnosticism. It like that is a critique, and he's comparing it to singularity, and he's not saying like all communism is this, but he's saying there's even a problem in communism of this particular outlook, and I think a lot of what he's saying in the book kind of mirrors his critique of communism in a way. Well, and also his what he's saying as a counter to it is equally what he says as a kind of in the way that he affirms communism.
Well, as if there's an efficient totality. If there's an efficient totality, I feel like singularity and communism offer two, relative significations, relatively similar significations as to a smooth functioning of a totality, and yet one actually proposes new antagonisms, right? Responds to the antagonisms of capitalism and provides newer antagonisms, whereas singularity is like, we're just going to do away with it altogether.
Yeah, one which is singularity, eradicates the gap. And
right.
In Žižek's discussion at the end of the last chapter, which we'll get into at another point, in a discussion of alienation, seeks to sort of repose the question of alienation in communism away from Marx's notion of alienation to a notion of constitutive alienation and a kind of healthy alienation,
which he calls separation.
Exactly, yeah.
Because one of his critiques of Marx and sorry, this is not a new point. I'm just saying like one of his critiques of Marx.
It was done.
Okay.
Thanks though.
No, and I don't mean to interrupt you, Peter, but I felt like, I was like, wait, is there another thing there? But no, go, Pete.
One of his critiques of Marx's understanding of capitalism and of communism, of Marx's communism, is that in some ways, as Žižek points out, Marx wants capitalism without capitalism. He wants a kind of antagonistically free, like a non-antagonistic society. And that's where Žižek understands Marx needs to be more philosophical and Hegelian.
Right.
All right, well, let's leave it there with the promise of maybe being a bit more specific next time on terms like alienation and separation and unconscious and all that stuff that we still have yet to talk about.
Well, that seems where it rests.
The unconscious will be cool. It's a shame that not really a shame. It's more of a shame for my own preparation. But I would like to talk about Fichte, but it's not really crucial to the argument.
I think that's it's almost like philosophy 101. But I think what we did is that we, by going through the first six, what did you call them? Limits. Yeah, the first six limits is that it leads us to the seventh chapter, right? Which is ultimately going to allow us to talk about the unconscious, but also the difference between alienation and separation, which involves that conversation about the unconscious. And just going back once again to the first episode on Hegel and a Wired Brain, is like the structure is in fact very important to this book. More seemingly almost because it's structured, more so than some of his recent books, is like there's a process.
Jake, you know what you know what it is? Sorry to jump in, but I was realizing as we were discussing this, like there's a similar structure to it as what Hegel is doing in Phenomenology of Spirit, where he's passing through, he's encountering various modes of thinking, and then sort of overturning them and moving on to another mode of thinking. So in the first 6 essays in this book, we encounter various objections to singularity on various philosophical and political terms, social terms, and then in the end, the end might be the kind of the moment of absolute knowing. This is maybe getting a little highfalutin, but absolute knowing is like, there's a sense in which it tears apart, right? So
Can I? Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. Finish. Sorry.
Well, because there are some contradictions in what he's saying at the end of the book versus what he's saying at the beginning of the book, and they're kind of obvious contradictions. So he must know that the contradictions are there. We've actually encountered a few of them in this discussion, because I think, Jake, you brought up a couple of points that he made later in the book that don't necessarily match up with our discussion of limits here.
Yeah. Which is why I was a bit confused.
Right, but it's significant in perhaps a more kind of Hegelian sense that these contradictions, these higher contradictions encountering lower contradictions, the contradictions at the end of the book encountering the contradictions at the beginning of the book, don't match up for the reason that they're developed out of, or they're sort of passed through those contradictions already.
Well, yeah, like brilliant.
And what would be like? It would make a lot of sense that he's like, his true inspiration there is Hegel, not only in the thought process, but in the actual structure of the argument.
Well, and this is my, like, when you said absolute knowing, maybe a version of absolute knowing put forth in the 7th chapter, embedded in this, very particular structure of Hegel and Wired Brain, is, I think, with this, this turn of subject and substance as subject, is a really important point, is because on some level, singularity actually puts forth a kind of notion of absolute knowing. Spirit fully coming to know itself, enfin, period, done. And I think what's interesting is Žižek saying, by way of an understanding of subjectivity, of the remainder of the naked subjectivity and the unconscious, and the virtuality of the unconscious, we're actually, there's an absolute knowing that is much more proper than the one suggested by singularity.
I had a sensation of feeling like we're giving away the ending, but
I think we should call it here because we're going a bit over time. But hey, it's been nice chatting. We'll talk again real soon.
Yeah, talk to you guys soon. Nice.
Bye-bye.
Intro 1.